Alright, so we're going to start early civil rights movement. Now, the civil rights movement itself is about getting rights for African Americans to be broken down into two eras. I call this early civil rights, and in this first video we're going to look at disenfranchisement and segregation. First off, what is disenfranchisement? It's a $10 word, if you will, but that prefix of dis means if you're discouraged, you don't want to do something. If you're disheartened, like this. So disenfranchisement, the whole big thing, and franchisement talks about, we say elective franchise means right to vote. So disenfranchisement basically is any way to get someone to stop voting. Now the way they went about that was, first off, they had a poll tax. Now here we have pay your poll tax. Now, and a receipt from a poll tax in the year 1900. In short, a poll tax is if you can't pay, you can't vote. They would charge somewhere in the neighborhood of maybe $1 to $1.25, which you go, well, that's not a big deal. That's like $10, $15 today. I mean, you would not have $10, $15 laying around. You go, hey, I'm going to go pay that. So, poll tax, there it is. Now, something to note here is that this was not only to exclude African American voters, but also poor white voters. They basically, in short, said we only want the people who have land and have power. That was the same name of the game back then. The second thing that came about was called a literacy test. Now, this is a copy from a 1965 Alabama literacy test, and in class we're actually going to look at one that's really, really interesting. And what you're going to see is literacy, as you understand it, means the ability to read and write. And these literacy tests were not about that. It was kind of a fool's test. And, can you master these things? And people would be sent answer keys and things like that. Again, that's to exclude African Americans. Now, if you could get around the poll tax and get around the literacy test, there was one that was kind of ironclad, and that's called the grandfather clause. Now, the grandfather clause basically said whatever social status your grandfather had, you had. So if your grandfather was a slave, then you were a slave, and thereby virtue could not vote. So these three methods were commonly used to keep African Americans from voting, in addition to the Klan marching around and lynching and kind of scaring them back into submission. Now, there exist two types of segregation. There is de jure segregation and de facto segregation. Now, de jure kind of sounds like jury, right? It is by law, and it was licensed by law. These were the Jim Crow in the South, as well as the slave codes, meaning if you broke this, you could potentially go to jail. The second type, now de jure no longer exists. That was basically taken care of by the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 65. But de facto segregation actually still exists today. It's in practice. This is segregation that becomes embedded in our customs and our institutions. Going to certain clubs, going to certain churches, going to certain barber shops, music. I mean, there's a lot of de facto segregation. School cafeterias is a big one, where you sit next to someone on the bus, or if you go and sit down next to someone in a class. So there still exists a way to get around this, and actually we're going to look more. We get into civil rights and some experience about this, all right? But that is the end of those two things. I know this was a short video. The other ones will not be as short, all right?